Great. Okay. All right. Thank you so much for joining me for this discussion, Professor Anne Krueger.
My pleasure.
Okay. So just wanted to start off briefly. Where are we in the world economy?
Well, we're obviously in uncharted territory, partly just because we've had so much success in so many things. The structure of the world economy has changed, and so there are new challenges as always. Where we are, however, is I think the United States is doing pretty well, probably a little bit better than most people thought it would at this stage of the recovery, although has been slow because of the construction problems. The United States is doing well. North America probably is doing pretty well. Australia has been doing very well. China, of course, slowed down, but is 7% growth or thereabouts, still a positive force. India has slowed down even more to about 4.8% and looks to have a little bit deeper troubles. But we have, of course, the European situation, which is, I think, the big question mark over the international economy. And the other big question is whether the Japanese can pull out of their now 2-decade-long slump.
Okay. Now, one of the things you mentioned, which I thought was very interesting in the speech, was trade barriers, and there's a risk that economies might be putting up trade barriers, and this might have a special risk, especially to developing markets. What's the risk?
Well, what I said was, of course, and it's true, that we've had this tremendous success over 50 or more years, where we've been opening up economy, where we've been globalizing, and where everybody's better off for it, especially the emerging markets who depended on it for much of their success and growth. We have, for a variety of reasons, not supported the open multilateral trading system under the WTO as much as we should, and so we see people going for preferential trading arrangements and not supporting the WTO, as I think it's going to have to be, given how integrated the world economy is. I don't see how we can do without the backbone of a strong WTO behind all this other stuff. And instead, the politicians are saying, oh, we can't do that, so they're going for preferential trading arrangements, bilateral agreements, sector-specific arrangements, and so on.
And this is especially a risk to emerging markets because they rely on this for growth.
Well, it will hurt everybody. If indeed we fragment into segments or cut down the openness to trade, it will hurt everybody, no doubt. But the emerging markets are so much dependent on trade at this stage, and it's so much more important for their growth. The United States has, what, 15% of GDP in exports, 40% in many countries.
Oh, okay. All right, so moving on to the specific challenges that China and India are facing. Why don't we start with China? What are you seeing in terms of growth, the challenges, and how can China fix those?
Well, they've had something of a property boom, as I'm sure you know. And so growth has slowed for that and other reasons. And they're talking about maybe getting between 7 and 8% this year. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. There are some people who are questioning whether that's temporary, excuse me, a slowdown, or whether indeed it's a transition to a new and somewhat slower growth rate. It may be some of both, of course, that they'll speed up after this. So there are some questions there. They have had a housing boom to some extent, and they're worried about housing prices. And that's a short-term challenge. Longer term, they've got a lot of issues. They have an issue that they still have with 700 million poor people mostly, not in the cities. They have a system whereby if you were born in the city and I was born in the country, and we work side by side, I'm still not a resident of the city, and you are. You have perks that I don't have because you're a resident of the city. And that's going to have to change for a whole variety of reasons, and I gather it's changing a little bit at the margins, but there's a lot to do. So they have that issue. They certainly have a corruption issue. They have tensions between East and West because development has been much more successful in the East than the West. So they've got the whole range of things and challenges that with growth every country has.
Sure, and given that, what type of growth rates are you seeing for China?
Well, as I said, I think there's a lot of uncertainty now as to what would be the new sort of normal rate of growth. Whether what we're seeing now is a cyclical slowdown or whether it's more the permanent one, I don't know.
Okay, and moving on to India?
Yeah, well, India had also accelerated growth, but about a decade later than China. India did very well until about 2008 or 9. Excuse me, since then they've slowed down, which is okay, but I think the slowdown is more deep-rooted than in China. I think they didn't get quite as far with their reforms, and they have more they have to do. So in the Indian case, labor market liberalization, I think, is crucial. It's important in China, but I think crucial in India. India's manufacturing sector is still only 15% of GDP, which is small, and manufacturing employment is not rising. So all those people are bottled up in the rural areas, and they have to find a way out. Education quality in India has to go up. Infrastructure is clearly a big problem, as everybody knows, so there are a number of issues there.
Okay. What I'll just finish off on lastly is, you mentioned, South Korea is really just risen up and stepped up its game
Mm-hmm.
throughout, all these decades. Is there any lesson that country can give to other developing markets?
Well, the South Koreans have probably been more single-minded in their pursuit of growth than most other countries I know of. I mean, and everybody has non-economic objectives, which is fine. But South Korea was so poor at the beginning that they really did see growth as their major objective, and they got a lot of political support for it. So it was very single-minded, and they've had very pragmatic policymakers. So when troubles have come, I mean, it isn't as if they have avoided all these kinds of issues that I just mentioned for India and China, but every time, except 1997, when such issues arose, the the Korean policymakers were there, and they were ready to change course before things got out of hand. And they've been pretty successful at that even to this day.
Okay, all right.